The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Millbrook Elementary as Sarah Chen arranged alphabet blocks on the reading carpet. Her students would arrive in 20 minutes, and she wanted everything perfect for their lesson on phonics. At 32, she had dedicated 8 years of her life to the small classroom in rural Montana, where the biggest excitement usually involved lost homework or playground disputes over kickball rules. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah smoothed her cardigan and adjusted the cheerful apple pin on her collar, the uniform of someone who had chosen education over ambition. Her colleagues saw her as the quiet teacher who stayed late to help struggling readers, who brought homemade cookies for faculty meetings, who never missed a parent conference. She was dependable, unremarkable, exactly what a small-town elementary school needed. What they didn't see were the calluses on her palms from years of weapons training, or the way her eyes automatically catalogued exit routes in every room she entered. They couldn't hear the military precision in her carefully measured speech, or recognize the controlled breathing techniques she used during stressful faculty meetings. Sarah had become an expert at invisibility, hiding skills that would terrify the parents who trusted her with their children. The first bell rang, and 23 third graders flooded into her classroom with the chaotic energy of 8-year-olds. Tommy Rodriguez waved a crayon drawing of his family. Emma Walsh carefully hung her backpack on its designated hook. Marcus Thompson rushed to the pencil sharpener, already behind schedule for the day ahead. Sarah's daily routine had been perfected through years of careful practice. Each morning, she arrived at school 30 minutes early to prepare lessons that would engage young minds while staying safely within the boundaries of approved curriculum. She had learned to speak in the gentle, encouraging tones that parents expected from elementary educators, each word carefully chosen to inspire rather than command. During lunch duty, she stood at the edge of the playground, appearing to supervise children at play while her trained eyes performed tactical assessments that had become second nature. She noted potential choke points near the jungle gym, calculated angles of approach from the parking lot, and mentally catalogued improvised weapons within reach. To her colleagues, she was simply being attentive. To Sarah, it was survival instinct disguised as professional responsibility. The other teachers treated her with the casual indifference reserved for reliable but unremarkable colleagues. Principal Davidson relied on her to handle difficult parents because of her calm demeanor. Mrs. Peterson, the veteran kindergarten teacher, often asked her to stay late for committee meetings because Sarah never complained about extra work. Coach Williams appreciated that she never caused drama in faculty meetings, unlike some of the more outspoken staff members. None of them suspected that their mild-mannered colleague had spent 6 years in Marine Force reconnaissance before medical discharge ended her military career. They had no idea that she could field strip an assault rifle in complete darkness, or that she held expert marksman ratings with 12 different weapon systems. Sarah had deliberately constructed a new identity so thoroughly that even she sometimes forgot the warrior who lived beneath the educator's facade. Her apartment reflected this careful deception. The living room contained educational journals and student artwork, while her bedroom closet hid a locked safe containing gear that most civilians would never recognize. Night vision equipment, tactical communication devices, and documentation from missions that officially never happened, shared space with lesson plans and parent conference notes. 2 lives existing in parallel, touching but never intersecting. The transformation had begun 3 years ago when Sarah realized she could never return to active duty. Shrapnel damage to her left leg had ended her military career, but left her with skills that had no civilian application. Teaching had seemed like a logical choice, a way to serve her country by shaping future generations instead of eliminating current threats. She had moved to Millbrook specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business. The town was small enough that everyone knew each other by name, but large enough that personal histories weren't scrutinized too closely. Sarah Chun, the teacher who had moved from California to escape big city stress, was accepted without question. Her carefully constructed background held up under casual inspection because she had learned that the best lies contained enough truth to be believable. The facade required constant maintenance. Sarah monitored her speech patterns to avoid military jargon, trained herself to show appropriate emotion during Disney movies at school events, and forced herself to participate in conversations about reality television and celebrity gossip. She attended church not from faith, but because it reinforced her image as a wholesome community member. Every interaction was a performance designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Her classroom had become a sanctuary where she could exercise subtle control without raising suspicion. She arranged desks to maximize visibility and minimize blind spots. The reading corner was positioned to provide clear sightlines to both entrances. Art supplies were organized not just for educational efficiency, but to ensure potential improvised weapons remained accessible but unnoticed. Parents who visited commented on how well organized and thoughtful her classroom was, never suspecting the tactical considerations behind every placement. Student behavior management came naturally to someone trained in psychological operations. Sarah could diffuse conflicts between children using techniques developed for international diplomacy. She recognized signs of abuse, neglect, and emotional trauma with clinical precision gained from years of interrogation training. Her gentle approach to discipline was actually sophisticated crowd control adapted for an elementary school environment. The children adored her, drawn to the quiet confidence that she projected without understanding its source. Marcus Thompson, whose father worked construction and whose mother cleaned houses, found comfort in Sarah's unwavering calm during his frequent emotional outbursts. Emma Walsh, brilliant but shy, flourished under Sarah's patient encouragement. Tommy Rodriguez, whose family had moved from Mexico 2 years earlier, benefited from Sarah's ability to communicate respect across cultural boundaries. Their parents saw what they expected to see: a dedicated teacher who genuinely cared about their children's education and well-being. They never questioned why she seemed so knowledgeable about international current events, or why she occasionally used words that seemed beyond typical educational vocabulary. Sarah had learned that people interpreted information through their own expectations, making her disguise nearly impenetrable. Faculty meetings were exercises in careful self-control. Sarah listened to colleagues complain about budget cuts and administrative demands while suppressing memories of operating with minimal resources in hostile territory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When other teachers expressed frustration about difficult students, she bit back responses informed by experience with actual human monsters. Her contributions to discussions were measured, helpful, and completely unremarkable. Principal Davidson had privately noted Sarah's reliability in his annual evaluations. She never called in sick, never created interpersonal drama, and consistently produced strong student outcomes. He had no idea that her perfect attendance record stemmed from military discipline rather than dedication, or that her calm demeanor during crisis situations came from training in battlefield stress management. The closest Sarah had come to discovery was during the previous spring's lockdown drill. A gas leak at the high school had required immediate evacuation of all district buildings, and Sarah's response had been subtly different from her colleagues. While other teachers showed appropriate concern and confusion, Sarah had automatically begun tactical assessment and threat evaluation. Her positioning of students and selection of evacuation routes had been so natural that no one noticed the precision behind her actions. That incident had reminded her how carefully she needed to monitor her responses. Years of combat training couldn't be completely suppressed, but they could be disguised as unusually good judgment and natural leadership ability. Sarah had spent weeks after the evacuation analyzing her behavior, identifying moments where her military background had shown through the teacher persona. The maintenance of her double life extended beyond school hours. Sarah's weekend activities were carefully chosen to reinforce her cover identity. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, attended community theater productions, and participated in book clubs with other unmarried professional women. These activities provided alibis for the time she actually spent maintaining her combat readiness through private training sessions in the mountains surrounding Millbrook. Every 2 weeks, Sarah drove 3 hours to a remote area where she practiced marksmanship and tactical movement. She maintained subscriptions to educational journals, while secretly following military publications through encrypted channels. Her continuing education officially focused on child development and literacy instruction, but unofficially included analysis of current threat assessments and emerging tactical methodologies. The isolation was the most difficult aspect of her new life. Sarah had spent years surrounded by people who shared her training, her experiences, and her understanding of what real danger looked like. Her military unit had been a family bound together by shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. Now she was surrounded by people who considered a broken copy machine a significant crisis and who had never imagined violence beyond what they saw on television. She found herself editing conversations before speaking, removing references to places she had been and experiences she had survived. When colleagues discussed their fears about school safety, Sarah listened to concerns about scenarios she had trained extensively to handle, offering reassurance based on expertise she couldn't reveal. The disconnect between her knowledge and her permitted responses created a constant internal tension that required careful management. Her students provided the emotional connection that made the isolation bearable. Working with children allowed Sarah to express genuine care and protection instincts that were central to her identity. She could channel her warrior nature into defending their right to learn and grow in safety. The classroom became a place where her protective instincts served a peaceful purpose, transforming weapons training into child development skills. Parents regularly commented on Sarah's natural ability to handle difficult situations. When Jeremy Martinez broke his arm during recess, Sarah's first aid response had been so calm and efficient that the school nurse had joked about her having medical training. When Ashley Connor had disclosed inappropriate touching by a family member, Sarah's careful questioning and documentation had led to successful intervention by social services. Her ability to manage these situations was attributed to teaching talent rather than interrogation and crisis management training. The deception had become so complete that Sarah sometimes wondered if she was losing herself in the role. She caught herself genuinely enjoying discussions about reading strategies and child psychology. She found authentic satisfaction in student achievements and real frustration with bureaucratic obstacles to education. The teacher identity was no longer just a cover. It was becoming a real part of who she was. Yet certain triggers still activated responses that reminded her of who she had been. The sound of helicopters flying overhead during outdoor recess made her automatically assess landing zones and extraction routes. News reports about international conflicts triggered analysis patterns that had once been part of daily briefings. Even in her most peaceful moments, Sarah remained a warrior temporarily assigned to a peaceful mission. The balance had held for 3 years through careful planning and constant vigilance. Sarah had successfully created a life where her past remained buried and her future seemed predictable. She had tenure track, community respect, and the satisfaction of meaningful work that served others. The system she had built seemed sustainable. Indefinitely. Nothing in her carefully constructed world prepared her for the events that would begin with an unexpected visitor during the Tuesday morning announcements. The knock on her classroom door seemed innocuous enough, but it would trigger a sequence of revelations that would shatter the invisible life she had worked so hard to maintain. Principal Davidson stood in the doorway with a man Sarah had never seen before, someone whose bearing and assessment patterns immediately triggered recognition alarms in her trained mind. The stranger wore civilian clothes but carried himself with military precision that couldn't be disguised. His eyes swept her classroom with the same tactical awareness she had been hiding for years, and when their gazes met, Sarah knew that her carefully maintained cover was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The visitor's presence changed the entire dynamic of her safe, predictable world. Sarah felt years of careful construction beginning to shift. As she faced the possibility that her past had finally caught up with the peaceful life she had built in the mountains of Montana. The children continued their morning reading exercises, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled their classroom, while Sarah prepared for the conversation that would determine whether her double life could survive discovery. In that moment, looking across her classroom at someone who clearly recognized what she was trying to hide, Sarah realized that the most dangerous mission of her life might be the one she had thought was over. The warrior and the teacher were about to collide in ways that would test everything she believed about who she had become and who she could afford to remain. The stranger stepped into Sarah's classroom with the measured gait of someone accustomed to dangerous environments. His name was Colonel Marcus Webb, though he introduced himself simply as a consultant working with the Department of Education on rural school security assessments. The explanation was plausible enough for Principal Davidson, who excused himself. After making introductory pleasantries, leaving Sarah alone with someone who clearly knew more about her background than any civilian should, Webb waited until Davidson's footsteps faded down the hallway before speaking again. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, a tone that immediately transported Sarah back to briefing rooms and command structures she had tried to forget. "Ms. Chun," he began, using her cover name with deliberate emphasis, "I think we need to have a conversation about your unique qualifications for addressing certain educational challenges." Sarah maintained her teacher persona, arranging student worksheets with practiced calm while her mind raced through threat assessments and response options. Her students were absorbed in independent reading time, their young voices creating a gentle background murmur that contrasted sharply with the tension suddenly filling the room. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, keeping her voice pitched at the same gentle tone she used for parent conferences. "My qualifications are pretty standard for elementary education. Bachelor's degree in education, state certification, continuing education credits." Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. He moved closer to her desk, his positioning deliberate and calculated to create psychological pressure without alarming the children. Sarah recognized the technique from her own training in information extraction, though she had never expected to be the target of such methods. "Miss Chun, we both know that your background extends considerably beyond elementary education. In fact, I'd venture to say that your real qualifications might be exactly what this community needs right now." The phrase "right now" carried implications that made Sarah's trained instincts flare with warning signals. She continued her careful sorting of papers, but her peripheral vision tracked Webb's body language for signs of immediate threat. Her students remained oblivious to the adult conversation occurring just feet away, their innocence creating a protective barrier that Sarah was determined to maintain. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting," she said, though her tone had unconsciously shifted to something harder, more controlled. "Is there a specific security concern at our school?" Webb nodded slowly, recognizing the subtle change in her demeanor. He pulled out a tablet and showed her photographs that made her blood run cold. Satellite images of Millbrook, thermal readings of the surrounding mountain terrain, and surveillance footage from locations she didn't recognize but that clearly showed tactical positioning around their small community. 3 days ago, a domestic terrorist cell was tracked to this area. They've established a base of operations somewhere in the mountains surrounding your town, and they're planning something that could put every resident of Millbrook in serious danger. Sarah's hands stilled on the worksheets as the implications registered. Her peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battlefield, and the children currently reading quietly at their desks could become casualties in a conflict they couldn't comprehend. The teacher identity she had carefully constructed suddenly felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. "What kind of threat are we talking about?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to young ears. Webb glanced around the classroom, taking note of the children before responding. The kind that requires specialized response capabilities, the kind that local law enforcement isn't equipped to handle, the kind that needs someone with your particular background and training. The moment Sarah had been dreading for 3 years had arrived with the brutal efficiency of a tactical operation. Her cover was blown, her peaceful life was ending, and the skills she had buried were about to become essential for protecting everything she had come to value. She looked at her students, still innocent and unaware, and felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, making one final attempt to maintain her cover. "I'm just a teacher." Webb's expression hardened. Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chen, Marine Force Reconnaissance, Silver Star recipient, expert. Marksman with 12 weapon systems, specialist in counter-terrorism operations and hostage rescue. Medical discharge following injuries sustained during classified operations in Syria. Officially dead according to military records, unofficially relocated under a new identity for security reasons. The careful construction of 3 years crumbled in 30 seconds. Sarah felt her teacher persona dissolving as the warrior underneath reasserted itself with frightening speed. Her posture straightened, her gaze sharpened, and her voice took on the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "How did you find me?" she asked, abandoning pretense entirely. "We've been monitoring potential assets in rural communities. When satellite intelligence identified unusual activity in this area, your name came up in the search for qualified personnel within operational range. It took considerable resources to penetrate your cover, but the current situation justifies extreme measures." Sarah stood and moved to the window, ostensibly checking on recess activities while actually conducting a security assessment of the school grounds. Her trained eye catalogued potential approaches, defensive positions, and evacuation routes with automatic precision. The transformation from teacher to tactical operator was so complete that even she was surprised by how quickly the old instincts returned. "What exactly do you need from me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The terrorist cell has taken hostages. Local law enforcement is outmatched, and federal resources are still hours away. They're holed up in an abandoned mining facility about 15 miles from here, and they've made demands that suggest they're planning something much larger than a simple hostage situation." Webb paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. "We need someone who can assess the situation, provide tactical guidance, and potentially execute a rescue operation if negotiations fail. Someone with your qualifications who knows the local terrain and can operate independently until backup arrives." Sarah felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The children in her classroom suddenly represented more than just students she cared about. They were civilians whose safety depended on her ability to neutralize threats they would never see coming. The teacher identity hadn't been a lie, but it had been incomplete. She was still a warrior, and warriors protected the innocent regardless of personal cost. "Who are the hostages?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "A school bus from the regional high school." 23 students and 2 adults, including the driver. They were taken during a field trip to the old mining museum. The terrorists are using them as leverage while they prepare for what our intelligence suggests is a much larger operation targeting civilian populations. The information hit Sarah like physical blows. High school students, barely older than her own third graders, were in the hands of people who viewed them as expendable assets in a larger campaign of terror. The abstract threat had become personal in the most devastating way possible, triggering protective instincts that had been dormant but never truly extinguished. Time frame? She asked, her voice now carrying the crisp efficiency of someone planning military operations. Unknown, but intelligence suggests they're operating on an accelerated timeline. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. We need assessment and potential intervention within the next few hours. Sarah looked back at her students, who were beginning to notice the adult conversation that had taken on an intensity inappropriate for their classroom environment. Emma Walsh was watching with the perceptive awareness of a child who sensed something was wrong. Marcus Thompson had abandoned his book entirely. His attention focused on the strange visitor who had changed their teacher's behavior in ways he couldn't understand. "I need to make arrangements for my class," Sarah said. The decision already made, though not yet spoken aloud. "They can't be here if the situation escalates," Webb nodded. "We've already coordinated with the principal to implement early dismissal procedures. Official explanation is a gas leak requiring building evacuation. Parents are being notified, and buses are being rerouted to ensure all students are safely away from the area." The efficiency of the operation impressed Sarah, even as it confirmed her fears about the severity of the threat. Government resources were being mobilized with the kind of speed that indicated imminent danger to civilian populations. Her quiet teaching career was ending not with resignation or retirement, but with a return to the battlefield she had hoped to leave behind forever. "Equipment?" she asked, already mentally cataloging what she would need for tactical operations in mountain terrain. "Everything you require is being assembled. Your personal gear from military service, current generation communication equipment, tactical vehicles, and full intelligence briefings on the target location and known opposition capabilities." Sarah realized that her carefully hidden equipment cache would no longer be necessary. The government had maintained records of her preferences and specifications, preparing for the possibility that they might need to reactivate someone who was officially dead. The thought was both comforting and terrifying, confirmation that her past would never truly be behind her. "Support personnel?" she continued, falling back into operational planning mode with unsettling ease. "Limited. You'll have communication support and intelligence updates, but field operations will be primarily solo until federal tactical teams can reach the area. Local law enforcement has been briefed on your authority, but they're not equipped for this level of threat." The familiar isolation of special operations was returning, but this time it felt different. Sarah was no longer a young Marine eager to prove herself in combat. She was a woman who had built a life worth protecting, who understood exactly what would be lost if she failed to neutralize the current threat. The stakes had become personal in ways that military missions had never been. Weapon specifications for the opposition, she asked, her mind automatically shifting to tactical planning. "Parameters." Webb consulted his tablet before responding. "Mixed small arms, likely military grade acquired through black market channels. Possible explosive devices, though specifics are unknown. Unknown number of operatives, but satellite thermal indicates at least 6 individuals at the target location." Sarah processed the information with the analytical detachment of someone trained to make life and death decisions based on incomplete intelligence. 6 opponents was manageable for someone with her skills, but the presence of hostages complicated every tactical option. Rescue operations were among the most difficult military missions, requiring precision that left no margin for error. Timeline. For decision? She asked, though she knew she had already committed to the mission the moment she learned about the hostages. Immediate. Every minute we delay gives them more time to consolidate their position or execute whatever larger plan they're implementing. Transportation is waiting outside to take you to the staging area. Sarah looked around her classroom one final time, seeing it through different eyes than she had just minutes earlier. The alphabet chart on the wall, the reading corner where struggling students had found confidence, the desk where she had graded thousands of assignments with the same careful attention she once gave to mission briefings. This space had been her sanctuary, but it was also proof that there were things worth fighting for beyond military objectives. "Give me 5 minutes to prepare my students for early dismissal," she said, accepting the mission with the same matter-of-fact tone she had once used to acknowledge orders in combat zones. Webb nodded and stepped back, allowing her to address the children who had no idea their teacher was about to transform back into the warrior she had been before they knew her. Sarah approached her students with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the morning, determined to protect their innocence even as she prepared to return to a world where innocence was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. "Class, I need everyone to put their books away and line up for an early dismissal today," she announced, keeping her voice steady and reassuring. "There's been a small problem with the building that needs to be fixed, so you get to go home early and spend extra time with your families." The children responded with the excited energy that early dismissal always generated, unaware that their teacher was experiencing the most profound transition of her adult life. As they gathered their belongings and formed a neat line she had trained them to create, Sarah felt the weight of leaving them behind. These children had given her purpose during the most difficult transition of her life, and now she was abandoning them to return to the violence she had tried to escape. "Miss Chun," Emma Walsh said quietly, tugging on her teacher's cardigan with small hands that had never known real danger. "Are you okay? You look different." Sarah knelt down to Emma's eye level, seeing in the child's concerned expression everything she was fighting to protect. The innocence, the trust, the belief that adults could keep them safe from dangers they couldn't imagine. For 3 years, Sarah had been one of those protective adults through patient guidance and educational support. Now she would protect them through methods they would never need to understand. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said gently, smoothing Emma's hair with the same careful attention she had once given to weapon maintenance. "Sometimes grown-ups have to handle difficult situations, but that doesn't change how much we care about you." As the children filed out of her classroom under the supervision of other teachers coordinating the evacuation, Sarah felt the final threads connecting her to her civilian identity beginning to fray. The woman who had spent 3 years nurturing young minds was about to become the soldier who specialized in eliminating threats with clinical precision. The transformation was necessary, inevitable, and absolutely terrifying in its completeness. Webb waited until the last child had left before speaking again. "Are you ready?" Sarah looked around her empty classroom one final time, memorizing details that might be destroyed if the current threat escalated beyond containment. The bulletin board displaying student artwork, the carefully organized supply closets, reading corner where Marcus had finally discovered his love of books. This space represented everything she had built to replace what she had lost in military service, and now she was risking it all to prevent others from experiencing similar loss. "No," she said honestly, removing her Apple Pen and placing it carefully on her desk, "but I'm going anyway." The walk to the parking lot felt like a journey between 2 different worlds. With each step away from the school building, Sarah felt her teacher identity receding and her warrior nature reasserting itself. Her gait changed, becoming more purposeful and alert. Her eyes began automatically scanning for potential threats and tactical advantages. Her breathing shifted to the controlled patterns that would sustain her through combat operations. The vehicle waiting for her was an unmarked SUV with tinted windows and communications equipment, that confirmed the federal nature of the operation. As Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, she caught her reflection in the side mirror and was startled by what she saw. The gentle elementary teacher was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, more focused. The transformation was happening faster than she had expected, as if 3 years of civilian life had been nothing more than a temporary assignment. "Staging area is 20 minutes away," Webb informed her as they pulled away from Millbrook Elementary. "You'll have time to review intelligence reports and prepare equipment before moving to the target location." Sarah nodded, already mentally transitioning from educational planning to tactical assessment. The children she had taught that morning felt like a different lifetime, even though barely an hour had passed since she had been helping them with phonics exercises. The civilian world was receding with each mile they traveled, replaced by the familiar territory of mission objectives and acceptable casualties. As they drove through the mountains surrounding Millbrook, Sarah began to see the terrain through tactical eyes, rather than the aesthetic appreciation she had developed during her teaching years. Ridgelines became potential sniper positions. Valleys offered concealment for approach routes, and the winding mountain roads presented both opportunities and vulnerabilities for various operational scenarios. The staging area turned out to be a temporary command post established in an abandoned ranger station, complete with satellite communication equipment and tactical displays showing real-time intelligence on the target location. Federal agents moved with the efficient coordination of a well-trained team, their presence confirming that this operation was being treated as a significant national security threat. Sarah was introduced to Agent Rachel Torres, the federal coordinator overseeing the tactical response. Torres had the bearing of someone with extensive law enforcement experience, but her deference to Sarah's expertise suggested she understood the limitations of traditional police work when dealing with sophisticated terrorist threats. "We're grateful for your assistance," Torres said as she led Sarah to the intelligence briefing area. "Your background makes you uniquely qualified to assess this situation and recommend appropriate responses." The briefing materials confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the complexity of the threat. The terrorist cell was well equipped, professionally trained, and operating with the kind of tactical discipline that indicated military or paramilitary backgrounds. The abandoned mining facility they had chosen for their base of operations offered excellent defensive positions with limited approach routes, making any direct assault extremely hazardous for both rescue teams and hostages. "Demands?" Sarah asked, studying surveillance photographs of the target location. "They want immediate release of imprisoned associates, safe passage to an undisclosed location, and cessation of federal investigations into their organization. Standard terrorist negotiation points, but intelligence suggests these demands are primarily meant to buy time for a larger operation." Sarah absorbed the information while studying topographical maps of the surrounding area. Her military training automatically began generating tactical options, each one weighed against the probability of hostage casualties and mission success. The teacher who had spent the morning worried about reading comprehension scores was gone, replaced by someone who calculated human lives in terms of acceptable losses and strategic value. "What's the larger operation?" she asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Torres consulted classified reports before responding. "Best intelligence suggests they're planning coordinated attacks on multiple rural communities, using this situation as a test of federal response capabilities. If they succeed here, they'll know how long they have before effective intervention arrives in similar locations." The implications were staggering. Millbrook wasn't just the target of a single terrorist incident. It was the testing ground for a campaign that could devastate dozens of small communities across the region. The children in Sarah's classroom, the parents who trusted her with their most precious possessions, the colleagues who had accepted her as a fellow educator, all of them were unknowing participants in a much larger conflict. Timeline for federal tactical response. Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would be inadequate. Minimum 4 hours for appropriately equipped teams to reach this location. Local resources are available immediately, but they're not trained for this level of threat. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with growing recognition that she was being presented with an impossible choice. Wait for federal backup and risk losing the hostages to execution or escalation of the terrorist timeline. Attempt immediate intervention with inadequate support and risk mission failure that could result in even greater casualties. Either option carried unacceptable risks, but the nature of command meant that someone had to make the decision anyway. "I need to see the target location personally," she said, accepting the reality that she was going to attempt a solo rescue operation against overwhelming odds. "Intelligence reports can't tell me everything I need to know about approach routes and defensive vulnerabilities." Torres nodded, though her expression showed concern about the risks involved in reconnaissance of an active terrorist position. "We can get you within observation range, but you'll be operating without backup if the situation deteriorates." Sarah was already mentally preparing for the transition from intelligence gathering to active combat operations. The weapons she would carry, the communication protocols she would follow, the contingency plans she would implement if negotiations failed and hostages were threatened with immediate execution. The familiar weight of life and death responsibility was settling on her shoulders like armor she had hoped never to wear again. "Equipment manifest?" she asked, her voice now carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding. "Tactical operations. Your personal preferences from military service, updated with current generation technology. Everything you specified in your operational requirements, plus additional options based on current threat assessment." As Sarah reviewed the equipment list, she realized that her government had never truly let her go. They had maintained detailed records of her capabilities, preferences, and operational methods, preparing for the possibility that circumstances might require her return to active duty. The thought was both reassuring and deeply unsettling, confirmation that her peaceful civilian life had always been temporary. The final briefing covered communication protocols, extraction procedures, and rules of engagement that gave her broad discretion to use whatever force was necessary to protect hostage lives. As she signed acknowledgement forms that officially didn't exist, Sarah understood that she was crossing a threshold that would permanently change her relationship with the life she had built in Millbrook. Whether the mission succeeded or failed, she could never return to being simply the elementary teacher who helped children learn to read. The warrior had been reawakened, and that transformation could not be undone. The only question now was whether she could use those skills to save the innocent lives hanging in the balance, or whether her return to combat would result in the kind of casualties that would haunt her for whatever remained of her lifetime. As she prepared to leave the staging area for reconnaissance of the terrorist position, Sarah caught herself thinking about her students one final time. Emma Walsh's concerned expression, Marcus Thompson's improving reading skills, Tommy Rodriguez's enthusiastic drawings of his family. These children represented everything she was fighting to protect, but they also symbolized everything she was about to risk losing through her return to the battlefield. The teacher and the warrior were no longer separate identities. They had become two aspects of the same person, united by the determination to protect innocent lives regardless of personal cost. Sarah Chun was going to war to preserve the peace she had built, even though success might destroy the very life she was fighting to defend. The reconnaissance vehicle dropped Sarah off 2 miles from the target location as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountainous terrain. She moved through the forest with the silent precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of invisible approach, every footstep calculated to avoid detection by both human sentries and electronic surveillance equipment. The familiar weight of tactical gear felt like coming home to a language she had tried to forget, but that remained fluent in her muscle memory. Her equipment loadout reflected years of experience in hostile environments. The modified M4 carbine carried familiar weight across her back, while the secondary weapon system remained concealed but instantly accessible. Communication equipment maintained constant contact with the federal staging area, though Sarah knew that once she initiated contact with the terrorists, she would be operating independently until the situation resolved one way or another. Approach route took her through terrain that reminded her of operations in Afghanistan, where mountain warfare had taught her to read landscape like a tactical manual. Ridge lines offered observation positions, but also exposure to counter-surveillance. Valley approaches provided concealment, but limited escape routes if the situation deteriorated. Every decision about movement and positioning carried life or death implications for both herself and the hostages she was attempting to locate. 3 hours of careful movement brought her to an observation position overlooking the abandoned mining facility. The terrorist position was more sophisticated than intelligence reports had suggested, with defensive preparations that indicated military-level tactical planning. Perimeter security included both human sentries and electronic detection systems, while the facility itself had been modified to provide excellent defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. Through her scope, Sarah counted at least 8 individuals, more than the 6 suggested by satellite thermal imaging. Their movement patterns and equipment suggested professional military or paramilitary training, confirming her suspicions that this was not a typical domestic terrorist cell but rather a well-organized unit with specific operational objectives, extending beyond the immediate hostage situation. The hostages were being held in a central building that had once housed mining equipment but had been converted into an improvised detention facility. Sarah could observe movement through windows. That suggested the captives were alive but under heavy guard. The bus that had transported them to the site remained parked outside, its presence serving as a constant reminder of the innocent lives hanging in the balance. Sarah established a hidden observation post and began the methodical process of intelligence gathering that would inform her tactical planning. Guard rotation schedules, communication patterns, weapon positioning, and structural vulnerabilities all required documentation before she could develop an effective intervention strategy. The teacher who had spent the morning planning phonics lessons was now calculating angles of fire and casualty probabilities with the same meticulous attention to detail. Her communication equipment crackled with updates from the federal staging area. Negotiations with the terrorists had stalled, with demands that could not be met without compromising national security interests. Intelligence intercepts suggested that the group was operating on an accelerated timeline, with plans to execute hostages if their demands were not met within the next few hours. The window for peaceful resolution was closing rapidly. Agent Torres' voice came through her earpiece with urgency that confirmed Sarah's assessment of the deteriorating situation. "We're intercepting communications that suggest they're preparing to move to the next phase of their operation. If you're going to act, it needs to be soon." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while continuing her surveillance of the target facility. The defensive positions were formidable, but years of experience had taught her that every fortress contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right combination of skills and desperation. The question was whether she could identify and exploit those weaknesses before the terrorists decided that the hostages had outlived their usefulness. Her tactical assessment identified several potential approach routes, each carrying different risk profiles and probability of success. The direct assault option offered the highest chance of neutralizing the terrorist threat but also the greatest risk to hostage safety. Stealth infiltration presented better odds for rescuing captives, but required more time than the current situation might allow. Either choice demanded skills that she had hoped never to use again. The decision was made for her when movement in the detention building indicated that the terrorists were beginning to separate hostages into smaller groups. Sarah recognized the tactical preparation for selective execution, a technique used to increase psychological pressure on negotiators, while maintaining leverage through the threat of additional casualties. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the situation escalated, beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Sarah activated her communication system to provide final intelligence updates to federal coordinators, beginning her approach to the facility. This is Recon 1, target assessment complete. 8 hostiles confirmed, professional-level tactical preparation, hostages being prepared for potential execution. I'm moving to intervention position. The response confirmed her authority to proceed with whatever action she deemed necessary to protect civilian lives. Federal backup remained hours away. Local law enforcement lacked the capability to handle this level of threat, and diplomatic solutions had been exhausted. The responsibility for 23 high school students and 2 adults rested entirely on her ability to execute a solo rescue operation against overwhelming odds. The approach to the facility required every technique she had learned during years of special operations training. Movement between cover positions, timing coordinated with sentry rotation patterns, and constant awareness of electronic surveillance systems that could compromise her position. The abandoned mining equipment scattered around the site provided concealment opportunities, but also potential obstacles that could trap her if the situation required rapid extraction. Sarah reached the perimeter of the facility as the sun began to set, casting the entire area in the dim twilight that would both help and hinder her infiltration attempt. Reduced visibility would conceal her movements, but also make target identification more difficult once she initiated contact with the terrorists. The next few hours would test every skill she had acquired during her military career and determine whether her return to combat could save the lives she had sworn to protect. Her first objective was neutralizing the perimeter security without alerting the main force to her presence. The sentries were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of potential approach routes, but their spacing created brief windows of opportunity for someone with her level of training. Sarah moved between positions with the patience of someone who understood that haste in tactical situations usually resulted in casualties that could have been avoided. The first sentry elimination required techniques she had hoped never to use again. The terrorist was eliminated silently and efficiently, his body concealed in a location that would delay discovery while Sarah continued her infiltration of the facility. The clinical precision of the action reminded her why she had been so effective in military service and why the transition to civilian life had been so psychologically difficult. 2 additional perimeter guards were neutralized using similar methods, creating a gap in the defensive coverage that would allow her to reach the main building undetected. Each action required moral calculations that she had spent 3 years trying to avoid, weighing the lives of armed terrorists against the innocent hostages they threatened. The mathematics of survival had no room for the gentle compassion that defined her teaching identity. Sarah reached the exterior wall of the detention building as voices inside indicated that the terrorists were beginning final preparations for whatever action they planned to take. Through a partially covered window, she could see high school students huddled together in a central area, their faces showing the terror of young people who had never imagined they could become targets of such violence. The sight triggered protective instincts that transformed her tactical planning from abstract military exercise to deeply personal mission. Among the hostages, she recognized several faces from community events she had attended during her years in Millbrook. David Chun, no relation despite the shared surname, was a senior who had helped with technology support at the elementary school. Maria Santos had a younger sister in Sarah's 3rd grade class the previous year. These were not anonymous casualties in a strategic operation, but members of the community she had chosen to protect through her teaching career. The realization that she knew some of the hostages, personally added emotional complexity to tactical decisions that required clinical detachment. Sarah forced herself to compartmentalize her feelings, drawing on training that had taught her to function effectively even when personal stakes elevated stress levels beyond normal parameters. The hostages needed her professional skills, not her emotional responses. Intelligence gathered through window observation confirmed that the terrorists were preparing to execute one hostage as a demonstration of their seriousness about negotiation demands. The selection process appeared random, designed to maximize psychological impact rather than target specific individuals. Sarah had perhaps 15 minutes before the execution would take place, requiring immediate action regardless of whether her tactical position was optimal. Her entry into the building utilized structural vulnerabilities she had identified during her reconnaissance phase. An emergency exit that had been welded shut but incompletely secured provided access to a maintenance area that connected to the main detention space. The route required precise timing and complete silence, as discovery during infiltration would likely result in immediate hostage executions. Inside the building, Sarah could hear the terrorists discussing their timeline in a mixture of English and what sounded like Arabic, confirming intelligence assessments about the international nature of the threat. Their conversation indicated that the hostage execution was intended as the opening phase of a larger operation targeting multiple communities across the region. Millbrook was not just under attack. It was being used as a testing ground for tactics that would be employed elsewhere. The interior layout of the building had been modified to create choke points that would funnel any rescue attempt into prepared killing zones. The terrorists had obviously studied law enforcement, tactical manuals, and designed their defensive positions to counter standard police assault techniques. However, their preparations assumed traditional team-based operations rather than the unconventional solo approach that Sarah was implementing. From her concealed position, Sarah could observe the complete tactical situation for the first time. 8 terrorists, heavily armed and positioned to cover all apparent approach routes. 23 students and 2 adults, restrained but not physically harmed at this point. Multiple improvised explosive devices positioned to deny rescue attempts and ensure facility destruction if the operation failed. The complexity of the threat confirmed that peaceful resolution had never been a realistic option. The terrorist leader was a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. His instructions to subordinates showed tactical knowledge that suggested military background, possibly foreign special forces or mercenary experience. Sarah recognized in him the professional competence that made this situation so dangerous and that required equally professional response to neutralize effectively. Her tactical plan required precise timing coordinated with the natural rhythm of terrorist activities. Guard changes, communication cycles, and attention patterns all created brief windows of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with her training. The plan was complex, risky, and depended on factors beyond her complete control, but it offered the best probability of successful hostage rescue given current circumstances. Sarah began her assault sequence by targeting the terrorist positioned nearest to the improvised explosive devices. His elimination had to be accomplished silently to prevent detonation of charges that would kill hostages, regardless of how effectively she dealt with the remaining threats. The action required her to move from concealment into partial exposure, accepting increased personal risk to protect civilian lives. The first terrorist was eliminated using techniques that demonstrated why Marine Force reconnaissance units were considered among the most effective special operations forces in the world. His death was immediate and silent, allowing Sarah to reach the explosive devices and begin disarmament procedures that would remove the threat of facility destruction. Each wire cut and circuit interrupted brought the hostages closer to safety, while increasing her own vulnerability to discovery. Disarming improvised explosive devices under combat conditions required skills that few military personnel ever mastered completely. Sarah worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that a single mistake would result in casualties that could not be undone. Years of training and experience guided her hands through procedures that were intellectually understood, but had to be executed perfectly under extreme stress. The second phase of her assault required neutralizing 3 terrorists positioned to cover the main detention area without alerting the remaining force to her presence. This meant moving through the facility while maintaining stealth discipline, engaging targets with precision that prevented return fire, and constantly monitoring hostage safety to ensure her actions did not inadvertently endanger the people she was trying to protect. 2 terrorists were eliminated in rapid succession using coordinated movement and fire techniques that had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. Their deaths created confusion among the remaining force, but also triggered security responses that would make the final phase of the rescue operation significantly more difficult. Sarah was now committed to completing the mission through direct confrontation rather than stealth operations. The terrorist leader's response to discovering his perimeter had been breached demonstrated tactical competence that confirmed Sarah's assessment of his professional background. Rather than panicking or implementing predetermined responses, he began adaptive countermeasures designed to neutralize an unknown threat while maintaining control over hostage assets. The situation was evolving into the kind of tactical chess match that defined high-level military operations. Sarah found herself engaged in running firefight through the interior of the facility, using cover and concealment to avoid return fire while systematically eliminating threats that stood between her and the hostages. Each engagement required split-second decisions about target priority, ammunition conservation, and collateral damage prevention. The skills she had hoped never to use again became essential for protecting lives she had come to value more than her own. The 4th terrorist elimination took place during a movement between cover positions, requiring her to engage while exposed to return fire from multiple directions. The successful engagement demonstrated muscle memory and tactical instincts that had been maintained despite 3 years of civilian life. Sarah realized that her warrior identity had never truly been abandoned, only temporarily suppressed beneath the teacher persona. Reaching the hostage area required neutralizing 2 additional terrorists who had positioned themselves to use captives as human shields. This created the most complex tactical challenge of the entire operation, requiring precision shooting that eliminated threats without endangering innocent lives positioned directly behind the targets. The margin for error was measured in inches, and failure would result in exactly the casualties she was risking everything to prevent. The shots were taken using techniques learned during hostage rescue training that emphasized psychological preparation as much as marksmanship skills. Sarah controlled her breathing, heart rate, and adrenaline response while calculating angles that would ensure effective target elimination without over-penetration that could harm hostages. The successful engagements required integration of technical knowledge, physical skills, and mental discipline that defined elite military capabilities. With 6 terrorists eliminated, Sarah faced the final 2 opponents in the main detention area where all hostages were being held. The terrorist leader had positioned himself behind a group of students, using them as a shield while his remaining subordinate maintained a position that provided covering fire for any rescue attempt. The tactical situation required innovative solutions that were not covered in standard military training manuals. Sarah's approach utilized psychological warfare, techniques designed to exploit the stress and confusion that resulted from seeing their carefully planned operation systematically dismantled by an unknown opponent. Her positioning and movement patterns created uncertainty about her location and capabilities while preventing the terrorists from implementing effective countermeasures. The psychological pressure was intended to force errors that could be exploited tactically. The conversation she initiated with the terrorist leader was conducted in multiple languages, demonstrating capabilities that confused and concerned opponents, who had planned for law enforcement response rather than military intervention. Sarah used intelligence gathered during reconnaissance to reference details about their organization and objectives, creating the impression that their operation had been compromised at levels they hadn't anticipated. During the psychological phase of the engagement, Sarah positioned herself for the final tactical actions that would determine whether the rescue operation succeeded or failed. The hostages remained in immediate danger as long as any terrorists retained the capability to harm them, requiring elimination of threats that were using innocent civilians as protection against retaliation. The final engagement sequence required simultaneous elimination of both remaining terrorists using coordinated movement and precision, shooting that left no time for response against hostage targets. Sarah moved from concealment while engaging both threats in rapid succession, accepting personal risk to ensure that neither terrorist retained the capability to harm captives during their final moments. The terrorist leader's elimination required a shot that passed within inches of student hostages, demonstrating marksmanship skills that had been maintained at expert levels despite years away from military service. His death ended organized resistance within the facility, but left Sarah with the responsibility of securing hostages and coordinating their safe evacuation from a location that remained potentially dangerous. The final terrorist was eliminated while attempting to reach a backup weapon position, his death completing the neutralization of all immediate threats to hostage safety. Sarah immediately began medical assessment of captives while maintaining security awareness in case additional threats remained undetected. The transition from combat operations to hostage care required different skills but equal levels of professional competence. Among the rescued hostages, Sarah found injuries that required immediate medical attention, but nothing that appeared life-threatening given prompt treatment. The students showed signs of psychological trauma that would require long-term counseling, but their physical condition suggested they had not been subjected to systematic abuse during their captivity. The two adult chaperones had attempted to protect students and bore evidence of physical confrontation with their captors. David Chun recognized Sarah despite her tactical gear and combat appearance, his expression showing confusion about how the elementary school teacher had appeared in full military equipment to rescue them from a terrorist attack. The recognition created complications for maintaining her cover identity, but those concerns seemed insignificant compared to the successful preservation of innocent lives. "Ms. Chun?" David asked, his voice showing the strain of prolonged stress, combined with bewilderment about her unexpected appearance. "How are you here? What happened to all the bad guys?" Sarah helped him to his feet while scanning the facility for any remaining threats that might have been overlooked during the assault phase. Her response was carefully measured to acknowledge his recognition, while avoiding details that might complicate official debriefings or compromise operational security for future missions. "I'm here to get you home safely," she said, using the same calm tone that had reassured third graders during emergency drills. "Everything else can be explained later, but right now we need to focus on getting everyone medical attention and reunited with your families." The evacuation process required coordinating with federal agents who had moved closer to the facility. During the assault operation, Sarah maintained security overwatch while hostages were transported to safety, ensuring that no remaining threats could interfere with rescue operations that had cost so much to achieve. Her role was transitioning from warrior back to protector, though the boundary between those identities had become permanently blurred. Agent Torres arrived with the first wave of federal tactical teams, her expression showing professional admiration mixed with concern about the implications of a solo rescue operation conducted by someone who was officially civilian personnel. The successful mission raised questions about Sarah's continued effectiveness in covert roles and whether her cover identity could be maintained after such a dramatic demonstration of capabilities. "Outstanding work," Torres said as she surveyed the facility that showed evidence of professional military operations conducted with clinical precision. "Preliminary count shows all hostages secured with minimal injuries, all hostile threats neutralized, and explosive devices safely disarmed." This was textbook special operations execution. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, while continuing to monitor the evacuation process that would reunite students with families who had spent hours fearing the worst possible outcomes. Her mission was operationally complete, but the personal consequences were just beginning to unfold. The teacher identity that had provided sanctuary for 3 years was permanently compromised, requiring decisions about her future that she was not prepared to make. The debriefing process took place at the federal staging area while medical personnel assessed. Hostage conditions and family reunification procedures were implemented. Sarah provided detailed tactical reports while maintaining compartmentalization between her operational activities and personal feelings about returning to combat operations. The professional assessment masked emotional complexity that would require private processing. Intelligence analysis of materials recovered from the terrorist facility confirmed that the Millbrook operation had been intended as a proof of concept for attacks on rural communities across multiple states. Sarah's intervention had prevented not only the immediate casualties, but potentially dozens of similar attacks that would have followed successful demonstration of terrorist capabilities. The scope of what had been prevented was staggering. Federal coordination with local law enforcement ensured that the official narrative would protect Sarah's cover identity while acknowledging the successful resolution of the hostage situation. The explanation would credit federal tactical teams with the rescue operation, allowing Sarah to maintain her teacher persona if she chose to return to civilian life. However, the choice itself had become more complicated than simple career preference. Principal Davidson arrived at the staging area as family reunification procedures were being completed, his expression showing relief about student safety combined with confusion about how the situation had been resolved so quickly and effectively. His conversation with federal agents focused on school security procedures and trauma counseling resources rather than operational details that remained classified. Sarah observed the reunion scenes between rescued students and their families from a distance that allowed her to witness the successful outcome of her mission without becoming involved in explanations that would compromise her cover identity. The joy and relief on both sides of those reunions validated every risk she had taken and every difficult decision she had made during the rescue operation. David Chun's reunion with his parents included gestures towards Sarah that suggested he was sharing his recognition of her involvement in the rescue operation. However, federal agents had briefed families about operational security requirements, ensuring that official gratitude would be directed toward appropriate channels rather than compromising personnel who required continued anonymity for future operations. The drive back to Millbrook took place in contemplative silence as Sarah processed the events of a day that had transformed her from elementary teacher to active combat operator and back again. The transition felt less complete than she had expected, leaving her with the realization that her warrior identity could not be permanently suppressed beneath civilian roles, regardless of how carefully she constructed alternative personas. Millbrook appeared unchanged as they drove through town, but Sarah's relationship with the community had been permanently altered by events that most residents would never fully understand. She had protected them using skills they would never know she possessed, maintaining their safety through methods that were incompatible with the gentle teacher identity they expected her to maintain. Her apartment felt foreign after a day spent in tactical operations, the educational materials, and student artwork seeming to belong to someone else's life. Sarah sat at her kitchen table still wearing combat gear, trying to reconcile the two identities that had collided so dramatically. The teacher and the warrior were both authentic aspects of who she was, but they seemed increasingly difficult to integrate into a coherent sense of self. The secure phone call from Colonel Webb came as she was finally changing from tactical gear into civilian clothes, the conversation addressing decisions about her future that had become urgent, following her successful demonstration of continued operational effectiveness. The government that had allowed her to disappear into civilian life was now reconsidering whether that anonymity served national security interests. The operation you conducted today saved lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic escalation of domestic terrorism, Webb said. Your skills remain at levels that make you extremely valuable for operations that require your specific combination of capabilities and local knowledge. Sarah listened while looking around her apartment that represented 3 years of careful construction of an alternative life. The books about child development, the photographs from school events, the lesson plans that had occupied her time and attention. All of it felt simultaneously precious and fragile, vulnerable to destruction by forces beyond her control. "What are you asking?" she said, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We're asking you to consider returning to active status for operations that require your specialized background. Not full-time military service, but consultation and intervention in situations where civilian law enforcement is inadequate and regular military forces are inappropriate." The offer represented everything she had tried to escape when she left military service, but it also acknowledged skills that had proven essential for protecting innocent lives. Sarah realized that her choice was not between warrior and teacher identities, but between accepting or denying the reality that both aspects of herself were necessary for serving others effectively. Her response would determine not only her personal future but also her ability to protect communities that faced threats they were not equipped to handle. The events of the day had demonstrated that evil existed in forms that required extraordinary responses, and that her background made her uniquely qualified to provide those responses when circumstances demanded them. "I need time to consider the implications," she said, buying space to process decisions that would affect every aspect of her life going forward. "Understood. But Sarah, what you did today reminded us why we recruited you in the first place. You have a gift for protecting people, whether that's teaching children to read or eliminating threats that would harm them. The methods are different, but the mission is the same." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her apartment trying to imagine returning to her classroom the next morning and resuming the routine that had defined her life for 3 years. The children would need consistency and normalcy after the stress of early dismissal and community emergency. They deserved a teacher who could focus on their educational needs, rather than processing the psychological aftermath of combat operations. Yet she also recognized that her protective instincts now extended beyond her immediate students to encompass threats that could affect any community where innocent people lived and worked. The teacher identity had taught her to care about individual development and growth, while the warrior identity provided tools for protecting those individuals from dangers they should never have to face. The decision crystallized as she prepared lesson plans for the following day, recognizing that education and security were not competing priorities but complementary aspects of creating environments where children could learn and grow safely. She could be both teacher and warrior, using different skills to serve the same fundamental mission of protecting and nurturing the next generation. Her phone call to Colonel Webb the next morning established parameters for a hybrid role that would allow her to maintain her teaching position while remaining available for operations that required her specialized background. The arrangement was unprecedented but reflected recognition that traditional boundaries between civilian and military roles were inadequate for addressing contemporary security challenges. Sarah returned to her classroom the following Monday with renewed appreciation for the privilege of working with young minds that remained innocent of the darker realities she had confronted. Her students sensed something different about her energy and focus, but interpreted the change as increased dedication rather than recognition of her dual identity as educator and protector. The official recognition for her rescue operation came through channels that protected her cover identity while acknowledging the significance of her contribution to national security. The medal arrived through anonymous delivery, accompanied by a note expressing gratitude from families who would never know her name, but whose children were alive because of her skills and courage. Emma Walsh approached her desk after Class 1 afternoon with the perceptive awareness that had always marked her as an exceptional student. "Miss Chun, you seem different lately. Stronger, I think. Like you know secrets that make you feel safer about things." Sarah smiled at the child's insight, recognizing that children often perceive truths that adults missed or chose to ignore. Sometimes grown-ups learn that they can do more to help people than they thought they could. That can make us feel more confident about keeping everyone safe. The explanation satisfied Emma's curiosity while acknowledging the fundamental truth about Sarah's transformation. She had discovered that her two identities were not contradictory, but complementary, each enhancing the other in ways that made her more effective at protecting and serving others. The teacher made her a better warrior by reminding her what was worth fighting for, while the warrior made her a better teacher by providing skills that could ensure her students' safety. Years later, as Sarah stood before a new class of third graders, beginning their educational journey, she carried with her the knowledge that protection took many forms. Sometimes it meant helping struggling readers find confidence in their abilities. Sometimes it meant eliminating threats that endangered innocent lives. Both roles required dedication, skill, and willingness to put others' needs before personal comfort. The small-town teacher had learned that her weapons training secret was not something to be hidden from, but integrated into a more complete understanding of service. She would always be ready to use whatever skills were necessary to protect those who depended on her, whether that meant teaching phonics or conducting rescue operations. The warrior and the educator had become one person, stronger and more effective than either identity could have been alone. Her students would grow up safer because their teacher understood that true education included preparing them for a world that contained both beauty and danger. They would learn to read and write and think critically, but they would also absorb lessons about courage, resilience, and the importance of protecting others that came from someone who had demonstrated those values under the most extreme circumstances possible. Sarah Chun had found her true calling not in choosing between her different identities, but in embracing them all as aspects of a life dedicated to service. The classroom and the battlefield had taught her the same fundamental lesson, that protecting others required whatever combination of skills and courage the situation demanded, and that the greatest strength came from refusing to accept limitations on one's ability to make a difference in the world. The recognition came quietly as Sarah preferred it. 6 months after the rescue operation, a small ceremony took place in the Pentagon's inner corridors, attended only by officials who understood the value of keeping heroes anonymous. The Distinguished Service Cross was presented without cameras or public acknowledgement, honoring courage that could never be publicly celebrated without compromising future operations. Sarah stood in her dress uniform, the fabric feeling foreign after months of returning to cardigan sweaters and comfortable teaching shoes. The weight of the medal felt insignificant compared to the weight of responsibility she had accepted in choosing to remain available for operations that required her unique combination of skills. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes, but its implications would shape the rest of her career. Back in Millbrook, life had settled into a new rhythm that accommodated both aspects of her identity. Her students continued to thrive under her guidance, though several parents had noted an increased emphasis on emergency preparedness and situational awareness in her curriculum. Sarah taught them to be observant without being fearful, aware without being paranoid, prepared without being anxious about dangers they might never encounter. Principal Davidson had quietly arranged for advanced security training for all staff members, ostensibly as part of updated district policies, but actually in response to recommendations from federal consultants who understood the value of having trained personnel in rural communities. Sarah participated in these sessions like any other teacher, though her suggestions carried weight that reflected experience beyond typical educational training. The terrorist threat that had brought her back to active duty proved to be part of a larger network that federal agencies continued to investigate and dismantle. Sarah's intervention had prevented not only immediate casualties, but had also provided intelligence that led to arrests across multiple states. The scope of what she had helped prevent grew clearer with each new development in the ongoing investigation. Her hybrid role evolved to include consultation on school security protocols for rural districts facing similar vulnerabilities. Sarah traveled during school breaks to assess facilities and train personnel, sharing expertise that could save lives without revealing the operational details that remained classified. These assignments felt like natural extensions of her teaching mission, expanding her ability to protect children beyond her immediate classroom. The integration of her two identities had become so complete that former military colleagues often remarked on how teaching had enhanced her tactical effectiveness. Understanding child psychology helped her predict civilian behavior under stress. Classroom management skills translated directly to crowd control in emergency situations. The patience required for education proved invaluable during extended surveillance operations. Emma Walsh, now in 5th grade, had become an exceptional student whose confidence and leadership abilities reflected the influence of a teacher who understood the importance of developing strength alongside knowledge. During a career day presentation, Emma spoke about wanting to become someone who protected others, though she couldn't articulate why that goal felt so important to her. Sarah recognized in the child's words the influence of lessons that had been taught through example rather than explanation. The small town of Millbrook remained peaceful, but its residents lived with unconscious security that came from having the guardian they would never know about. Sarah Chun had found her true calling in the intersection of education and protection, proving that the most effective service often came from those who refused to accept limitations on their ability to make a difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.